morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to head into chapter 8. We'll do all of chapter 8 today. And but before we get started, would someone like to open us in prayer?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sean. Thanks.
Lord, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for the chance to gather and to study your word. And we just ask that you would direct Terry, Lord, as he leads us in this, and that you would give us a willing mind and spirit to learn about you and to get to know you and your word better, Lord. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
So last week we got the first vision of this change in the book of Daniel from narrative to these apocalyptic visions. And in that we saw the progression of kingdoms. And while they weren't called out in that, we were able to look at some of the interpretations around how that's done. And but I think ultimately we understand it doesn't matter who it is, that all kingdoms pale in comparison to the kingdom of God, which will rule and reign forever. However, with that said, this week we do dig a little deeper and we get some specifics around what is, or maybe some interpretation around some of the other nations. So with that, I would remind us that Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him." That no matter what we see, we understand that these are all under the sovereignty of God's will and his action. So as chapter 8 starts now, we look more closely at some of those kingdoms that may have been introduced in chapter 7 and in chapter 2. So just like last week where we had a sort of a tri-section part of the book, this really breaks into two. You have the vision and you have the interpretation. So with that, would someone like to read verses 1 through 14?
Okay. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram, and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great even as the great prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state."
Thank you. So we'll stop and pause, just kind of reflect here. So we've got vision. You've got a ram. When it says it had, in the ESV, it says its horns were high, which means long, right? It also means long. So they're both long, but one horn is longer than the other. And so it's going out there, north, south, west. It's just owning everything. And so then we turn and we see a ram coming, right? And this ram comes and it's got one conspicuous, right, really noticeable horn on its head. And it moves so fast it doesn't even touch the ground. It goes. And it comes and it fights the ram and it defeats the ram. Once that ram is defeated, the horn is broken, and from that broken horn spring 4 new horns. And so, and of those 4 horns, a little horn, another little horn, right, comes up, and it gathers power, and it does some things, and it persecutes the saints, and it does something with worship, and to the point where it's 2,300 days that you don't have rightful worship, but then it's restored. So that's the vision that Daniel has. So again, here he is, he's asleep, he has this vision, and this is what he sees. Now, thankfully, my work is done because it's interpreted. So who would like to read the last half there, verses 15 through 27?
I will.
Go ahead. Thank you.
When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be in the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken in place, of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressor has reached their limit, a king of bold face, who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men, and the people who are the saints. By this cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and his own mind shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. And he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it.
Thank you. Any questions? All right. So we hear that, we have some names kind of attached to these symbolic representations. So you have Medo-Persia brought up, you have Greece brought up, and then you're sort of walked through what's to come. So guys, I got to tell you, this makes me really happy because this is right in my wheelhouse, because we're going to talk history today. And we're going to talk the vision that God gives to his people that we know is fulfilled in a nearer context, but we can also talk about what that means for the future. So let's start first. So Daniel, the first couple of verses. So in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the capital which is in the province of Elam. And I saw the vision, and I was on the Ulai Canal. So the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. So understanding that last week it was the vision took place in the 1st year of Belshazzar's reign. So Belshazzar, like we know him from chapter 5. He's the dude that has a party, and then the handwriting on the wall, and he loses his control of himself, and then we don't hear of him anymore because the Medes and the Persians come. So, but this is toward the beginning of his regency, and I say that because he was the eldest son of Nabonidus. He was the last king. He was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the last king of what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And so Belshazzar was his regent, so this takes place in 556 BC, in the 3rd year of his reign. It also says that I was in Susa. Now, I know you can see the answer there, but Susa shows up in what other books? In Esther, right? Esther was in Susa, takes place in Susa. And Nehemiah says, hey, I was in Susa, and I went, and my face was not happy, and I got to go back. So, Susa, where is Susa? Well, this is the Babylonian Empire. I thought maybe it would show up better, but so you can see Susa's here. Now, here is Babylon. So Babylon is in the place of current day Baghdad, right? So where the Tigris and the Euphrates River come together, that is where Babylon is. So Susa is to the east in what's now Iran. So it's right over the border, the current border of Iraq in Iran. This would have been the territory of the Medes and the Persians. So we see that that Daniel is transported to Susa, and then within Susa you have the Ulai Canal. Well, actually, the Ulai is a river, so he's standing on the banks of the Ulai River, sort of in that area. So it's taking place in western Iran, current western Iran, on the banks of the Ulai River when he has this vision. So, without going and reading the whole thing, I saw, behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal that had 2 horns, right? And so we went through all that, and the ram is mighty and goes north, south, and west, and whatever it does, it controls it, it runs it. Then the goat comes, and the goat and the ram fight, and then you have a goat that the horn of the goat is broken after it is successful, and 4 horns come up. So, what do we learn? So there are 2 great nations, right, that will rule and come into conflict. And the goat will defeat the ram, and from the conspicuous horn, a prominent ruler, will come 4 other rulers, and from those 4 will come 1 horn that will be the most powerful and impact the glorious land, which is Israel. And finally, there's something this leader does that impacts the sacrificial system in an aggressive and troubling way. So, kind of talked through that at the beginning as we read. But we see now we have the stage set. There's going to be 2 great kingdoms. They're going to come into conflict, and then 4 kingdoms will rise out of that conflict, and then from those 4 kingdoms there'll be 1 king that we hear about. So, when I, Daniel, had the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. So here, we are introduced to Gabriel. And his name means strong man of God, or God is my warrior, right? So it's one of the interesting things about the book of Daniel is it's in Daniel that we actually learn the names of angels. In other books, in other Hebrew scripture books, the angels are not named. We know that the angel of Yahweh, or the angel who comes and gives a message, but they're never named. Here, in the book of Daniel, we have Gabriel that's identified here, and then we'll see next week as well. And then we also see that in his name in the New Testament, in Luke. Where do we see Gabriel in Luke?
The Annunciation.
That's right, in the birth narratives, right? It is Gabriel who comes and makes the announcement of, he is here. He is here. Then we have Michael. And Michael is, you will see, announced in chapter 10 and chapter 12. We also see Michael in Jude and in Revelation. So we'll get into Michael's name when we get there. But it's really a cool name. I always wished that my name was Michael when I found out what it meant. So the time of the end. So Is this the end of the world? So most believe that this refers to the end of this epic, right? So when you think about all that's happened, you have the prophecies, right? That say Babylon's coming because you have not been faithful. Babylon comes, Babylon takes Israel into captivity, into exile, and there they are. And this is where Daniel is. He is in exile. He is serving the Babylonian kings as one of their magi, actually the chief magi. And so he is here, and when it says for the time of the end, most would say they're saying that this is now what will happen once we return to the glorious land and the people are restored to Israel. That this would be things that happen during that time as sort of a precursor to the coming of the Messiah. Right? So the end of the age before the Messiah comes, that would be the end. So that seems to be the most popular, answer to the end. But I would say, okay, sure, but there, as we've seen many times, there are lots of layers, right? The same thing with, is it possible to be true that the text allow that the little horn of chapter 8, which I'm going to talk about being Antiochus IV, that not only is that for a nearer context, but also for a greater context? And wouldn't that also be true here, that there are things that will happen, and while this is Mede and Persia and Greece, that down the road there could be other nations that represent the same thing, that could be a sign of the end. So while this is dealing with, and will deal with some very finite historical data, it doesn't mean that it isn't a shadow of things to come. It isn't a type of what will happen at the end. So just keep that in mind. I know we'd like to have an answer and know on March 15th of 2025, Jesus is coming back, so get your lawn chair and let's go. It's just, it's not going to happen that way. And that's why Jesus tells us in the Olivet Discourse to be ready, to be on our guard, to be watchful. And we'll know. There will be, right, last week we talked about, there will be those who come and say, I am the Christ. And there will be wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes. And those are simply the beginning of the birth pangs. So we have to be on guard and say, okay, we understand that this amazingly, we'll see, can be tied to, this prophecy can be tied to things that have happened, but it doesn't mean that that's it. That there is a greater context that can be seen here. So, let's start. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face on the ground, but when he touched me and made me stand up, he said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be in the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. And as for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. So, what do we know about the Medo-Persians? Well, they were two people from the greater eastern area or Middle Eastern area, and the Persians found their foundation in modern-day Iraq, right? So the Persians were a people, the Medes were a people, and they came together and they formed one big Medo-Persian empire. So again, you can't really see it, but it took. So you have Assyria, you have Media, and Persia, and then Babylon is in there as well. So they were the four great kingdoms that were surrounding, and influencing what happened south, aside from Egypt, right? So, jumped ahead. So you have here the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Medo-Persians were led by whom? Oh, I can't hide it, sorry. King Cyrus II, right? So when you look in chapter 5, and stuff goes down, and Belshazzar is extricated from his rule, that's Cyrus that comes, right? So Cyrus is the king. He captured Babylon in 539 BC, and it occurred near the end of the Babylonian exile. Within a short time, Daniel became a trusted advisor to the new Medo-Persian Empire. So again, think about this. Go back to Joseph. Joseph is put in Egypt and jailed. But he prospers no matter where he goes because the hand of God is on him and the sovereignty of God. Here, you have Daniel, who's brought over to the Babylonians, and he becomes the chief of the magicians, the chief of the magi, and yet he still becomes a trusted advisor under the new regime. Typically, when new regimes come in, what happens to the old regime? They're voted out, right? So we see here that Daniel, again, is made to prosper and becomes a trusted advisor in that empire. And the kingdom of the Medes and Persians was later ruled by Artaxerxes II, or Ahasuerus, who you see married Esther, right? So Persia was the stronger of the two empires. And so Persia, so you've got Medes and the Persians, and they say both big horns, but one's bigger than the other. So the Persian Empire was the stronger of the two. So that's where you have that correlation. Another cool thing is the Persians would put rams at the head of their battle columns when they marched into battle. So when the Persians were coming, you had to deal with the horns, and then you got the spears and everything else. So they would have, that would be their sort of their symbol was the ram. So it makes sense that you would see that as well. Some really cool things though about Cyrus. Daniel's not the first place we hear about Cyrus. In fact, many hundreds of years earlier, this guy named Isaiah said this: "Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver and do not delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will have no pity on children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. Sharpen the arrows, take up the shields. The purpose concerning Babylon is to destroy it, for that is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance for his temple. Set up a standard against the walls of Babylon. Make the watch strong. Set up watchmen. Prepare the ambushes, for the Lord has both planned and done what is spoken concerning the inhabitants of Babylon. Prepare the nations for war against her. The kings of the Medes, and with their governors and deputies, and every hand under their dominion." Who says of Cyrus? "He is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill my purpose," saying of Jerusalem, "She shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to the anointed, to Cyrus, and those whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of the kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed." So you have in Isaiah and Jeremiah the prophecy that the end of the Babylonians will come with the Medes and the Persians. And then Isaiah goes on to say, oh, by the way, when it says, "Who says of Cyrus?" That's the prior verse is Yahweh says of Cyrus that he will be Yahweh's shepherd. And who is it that restores Israel to the promised land? It's Cyrus. It's the decree of Cyrus that lets them go back. So in this, again, we see the ram, we understand the Medes and the Persians. If you're hearing this, you're thinking, well, wait a minute, Jeremiah and Isaiah already told us to look for that.
So, do we know if the Jews, while they're in exile, have access to Isaiah and Jeremiah?
They did. They did. They were allowed to practice. They were allowed, I mean, if you think, just go, like, they were asked to bow, and they did not. But they were free. There was a modicum of religious freedom within the Babylonian Empire. And which is why, without getting into the whole historical diaspora, many of the Jews stayed because they had set up their lives and were able to lead their lives according to their faith in Babylon and throughout the world at that point. So, if you think about the Assyrians, right? What did the Assyrians do? They came and they supplanted. They took people from Middletown and moved them to Asbury Park, and they took people from Asbury Park and moved them to Middletown. And so there would be these mixtures, right? That's why the Samaritans were seen as unpure. But there would be these mixtures that are around. But then people stayed because they're like, you know what? My family's here. I never thought I'd live in New Jersey, but I'm staying. That kind of stuff, you know. So so yes, they did have access to it. So when if you're reading this, right, you're like, whoa, look at God at work. Look at God at work. So, and I put here a brief interlude. So in between the ram and the goat, I guess I would say as the ram is going north and south, right? As Medo-Persia went north and west and south, they did have campaigns against Greece. In fact, the Persian Wars refers to the conflict between Greece and Persia in the 5th century BC, which involved the two invasions, right? There was an invasion in 490 BC, there was an invasion in 480 BC. And several of the most famous and significant battles of history were fought during the Persian Wars. And so if I said to you Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, these were legendary and continue to be legendary battles. And ultimately, while the Medes and the Persians did have their way in Greece, Greece ended up being victorious. So think about it. In 490, Darius I comes and he goes after Greece. And at the Battle of Marathon, he is soundly defeated, and the Persians go back to Asia Minor. Then, the most famous of the battles, right? At the hot gates of Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans stood, and they stood against Xerxes and the mighty Persian army. And while they didn't ultimately win, they did slow them down enough so that the Battle of Salamis, the Persian fleet was destroyed. So they made a little incursion, and then they were pushed back. Now, later on, Xerxes II did get into Greece, went to Athens, burned it, but they had all escaped out into the countryside and found it to be nothing, and then they left, right? They went in, they did some bad things and left. So you have this conflict going on between Persia and Greece. This didn't come out of nowhere. So it kept going on. So, now we read, and the goat is the king of Greece, and a great horn between his eyes is the first king. Alexander the Great is that king, the first king. And Alexander was clearly one of the world's great military strategists in that he never lost the battle. In fact, the legend is that his father, Philip of Macedonia, had been fighting the Persians his whole life. So young Alexander crosses the Bosphorus and he comes into Asia and he throws a spear in the ground and he says, "Thank you for letting Greece have Asia. I now claim this for Greece." And from there, he never lost the battle. In fact, he saw his campaigns as revenge on the Persians for what they had done in the 5th century, coming in, storming, burning, and really coming after the Greek civilization. So by 333 BC, Alexander won back all of Greece. So at some point there were Persian outposts along the eastern shore of Greece. He pushed them out of there, and he took over Western Asia. In fact, he went as far as Pakistan, right, to take over and rule there. So, what is it that he famously said? "I'm sad that there are no more kingdoms to conquer." At 33, he had reached the pinnacle of his life and died. Now, there are three things, or three major causes that people say. One was he died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was a heavy drinker, and they believe that he died of alcohol-related liver disease. Another was he caught a fever and died from that fever. And then another is, there's always political intrigue, and in fact, when we'll get into the next part, maybe some of those guys decided that they could do things better than Alexander now because he had kind of gotten soft and weak, and they poisoned him, and he died of strychnine poisoning. So here comes Alexander, the great conspicuous horn, the first king of Greece, who comes, who breaks the Medo-Persian Empire, who now takes over and starts to Hellenize the world, right? Do you understand what Hellenization is? Someone explain it to me. Greek culture is everywhere now. So when you go to places like Caesarea and Philippi, you have Greek culture there. You have theaters set up that they never would have had before, right? So you have Greek culture start to grow up. And I'm going to say this, what was the most important aspect of Hellenization? The language. The Greek language becomes the language of the world, the lingua franca. That will have effects in the future. So you have that. So then, the four horns that replace Alexander. So Alexander dies, right? So as for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, four kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So after Alexander's death, right, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus, right, they all take over and they split up his kingdom. So you have Seleucus really in Asia Minor, Ptolemy went to Egypt, and then Cassander and Lysimachus take over like Syria and the Middle East, and they divide it up. So, of course, these guys can't get along, right? And they get into a battle, and they have multiple battles, and they fought amongst themselves. And at the Battle of Ipsus, at that point, the kingdom is reduced to three major rulers. You have Ptolemy, who had Egypt. You have Antigonus, who had Greece and Macedonia, and Seleucus, who takes over Asia Minor. So even though the scripture doesn't talk about it, right, it starts with the four kings, and eventually it's going to work its way down to one that is more prominent. In fact, out of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. And at the latter end of the kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men, and the people who are the saints. So, after many years of intrigue and infighting, you have a king that arises from the Seleucids, right? So between 332 and 167 BC, Israel was ruled first by the Ptolemies, the Egyptians. So you have the Ptolemite kings. Do you guys know who the last of the Ptolemite rulers were? She got bit by a snake. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemite rulers. It was after Cleopatra that Rome takes over Egypt, is it not? So you have the Ptolemites and the Seleucids. So you really now, there are two great kingdoms, the Ptolemites and the Seleucids, right? They take over, and it's really the Seleucids that not only take over Asia Minor, but go through the Middle East up into Syria. And the Ptolemites are simply in the Egyptian area. So you have these two great ones. So you have where it says to the east, and to the glorious land, and to the south, right? So all that area around Israel is ruled by the Seleucid kings. And there's one in particular that arises. In 167 BC, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, which means a god manifest, he responds to a civil war in Jerusalem, and he attacks the city. So he is the fourth of his line of these Seleucid kings, and the Seleucids become well known for their battle. They become well known for their political savvy, and they really talk and fight people out of their lands. And so they make these treaties with their brother kingdoms, and then they break the treaties and they take over the land. So they really grew and grew, and that's how the Ptolemies became really sort of sequestered in Egypt, because Egypt is a hard place to invade because of the geography and what you have to go through to get across. So they were sequestered as the Seleucids started to grow through Asia Minor and the Mideast. So you have this line of kings that all named Antiochus. Some of them were great. Antiochus I was a very kind king, took care of the people. But then they got increasingly worse and more vicious. And so when you get to Antiochus IV, when you think of his name Epiphanes, he has a kind of a high opinion of himself, right? He says he is a god manifest. So as we go on and read, it became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offerings was taken away from him, and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of the transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard the Holy One speaking, and another Holy One who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and given over to the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. And by his cunning he shall make the seat prosper until it's under his hand. And in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand." So I put that in juxtaposition. So in the vision, you see this horn, right? It's doing some really bad things. It is, and it's impacting the sanctuary, even to the point where it goes against the Prince of Princes. Interesting, and it not explained though, right? So when you get to the interpretation, and Daniel just says, "I was told that he came up against the Prince of Princes." You're like, well, wait a minute, what's that? So we'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. Well, let's talk about what Antiochus has done. So Antiochus and Epiphanes. So Antiochus comes, right, to Jerusalem. Comes in with his army. He really started in 168 BC and in the surrounding regions, and he moves in toward Jerusalem. So in 167 BC, he comes and he sieges Jerusalem and he takes over. And so he momentarily puts down the rebellion and he takes control of Israel. So comes in, he says, "Enough is enough, no more rebellion. You guys are going to listen to me. I'm going to be here, and I'm going to make sure that things go the way they're supposed to go." And part of that is that he outlaws the practice of the Jewish faith. In the land of Jews, you can no longer be Jewish. There is a movement to come in and say, nope, we're going to make everyone here a Seleucid. You are no longer going to have a God greater than me. Greater than. Now, another thing about Antiochus, right, a God manifest, he thought he was Zeus. So he, again, practicing the pagan religion of the day, which would have been the monotheistic Greek religions, he saw himself as Zeus. He was Zeus embodied. And so, being the mightiest of them, he was going to rule like the mightiest of them. And that meant there could be no competing affection for worship. And that's why he removed the Jewish religion under pain of death. So you would be killed if you practiced your faith. So if anyone circumcised their sons, they were killed. If anyone followed the kashrut, which is the kosher food laws, they were killed. If anyone kept the Sabbath, they were killed. So things that would have been, right? So think through the history of Israel. What is the sign of the covenant between God and Israel? Circumcision. It is what sets Israel apart from all of our nations? What is it about the Levitical laws that are important? The kashrut, right? The understanding that we are different and we will eat differently. In fact, we see a sort of an echo of this at the beginning of Daniel, do we not? What is it that Daniel and his friends won't do? They won't eat the delicacies of the king's table. They stick to vegetables and water. So they are saying, we are not going to make ourselves impure with this food, but we're going to stay true. And so what Antiochus is saying, no, you're going to eat what I eat because you're going to be like me. And you're going to worship me and not Yahweh. And finally, what is the Sabbath? What is the Sabbath for the Jewish people?
God ordained day of rest.
And what do you do during that day of rest?
Worship. Remember.
So I have removed the sign of the covenant. I have removed what makes me significantly Jewish to the outside world, and I have removed your worship. I have utterly taken everything from you that makes you even in any way be representative of the people of God. And if you refuse, I'm going to kill you. So, you were to get baptized, if you were to have your children come to church, if you were to worship Jesus, and someone came along and said, no, I will kill you for that. Think about where you would be, how you would feel. And that was Israel. That was Judah. That was Jerusalem at this time period, where you have this king come in and utterly obliterate everything that you hold dear. If Yahweh is the center of your existence, he has put himself in the place of Yahweh in your life, under pain of death. Then he does one more thing. He set up what the Jews would come to call the abomination of desolation, looking back at the book of Daniel. Do you know what that was?
Sacrifice of pig on the altar in Jerusalem.
He goes to the temple, right, in Jerusalem. He proclaims himself a god, and he sacrifices a pig on the altar of the temple to Zeus, basically to himself. When we see that he is the one who comes and puts himself in the place of God in the temple, he puts himself in the place of God in the temple, and he takes an unclean animal and he sacrifices it on the holy altar of God. In other words, he says, whatever. And in that, you see that, a lot of people would say, look at that and say, that is him coming up against the prince. That he has stood up against the prince. And, it's interesting though, it's the Prince of Princes. Because when you stand and sacrifice and proclaim yourself God, whose right is that? Whose right is it to say, I am the Prince of Princes who has sacrificed for my people, for my God? He's putting himself in the place of the Messiah. He is a shadow of the Antichrist who would say, Jesus is not who he is, I am. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but you think about that language, the Prince of Princes. Why isn't it King of Kings? So yes, in the context, many people say, yeah, he's put himself in the place of God. But the language of Prince of Princes really echoes more for us. So that's why I would say, in the moment, we see a fulfillment, but there's something more going on here. This is pointing to something else. So, then Antiochus finds out it's not so easy to be God. And the people continue to revolt. In fact, have you heard of the revolt of the Maccabees? Has anyone ever read the book of Maccabees in the Apocrypha? It's worth reading. It's a good read. I'm sorry. I'm struggling a little bit there. That's me struggling. Anyway, so the book of Maccabees talks about this time of the Maccabean kings, and certainly talks about this time of what's going on with Antiochus. So in 167 and 142 BC, the Maccabee family led a revolt against the Seleucid king that succeeded through guerrilla warfare. Right, so this wasn't an on battle. This was hit them in the dark, hit them where they're weak, make them feel not safe, do it with a small unit and be stealthy, because they knew they couldn't come up against this power. So it was 1,000 paper cuts that they came after them. So this continues to go. In fact, one of the most famous stories of the Maccabean revolt is what? The Hanukkah story, right? It's during this time that they sequestered themselves in the temple. And in the reconsecration of the temple, they're there being under siege, and they had the oil that burned for 8 days to keep the lamps lit in the temple. So that's, this is the time period that we have the Hanukkah story come from. So Antiochus started to meet with a lot of defeats, right? So his forces are getting weak, they're getting demoralized, now suddenly they're not fighting as well. And in 164 BC, he was defeated, his army was defeated on the Judean coast. And they went into retreat, and during that retreat, Antiochus succumbed to a disease and died. And he shall be broken, but by no human hand. So he wasn't killed in battle. He wasn't killed as part of guerrilla warfare. He died from disease. This king who proclaimed himself God couldn't sustain his life. And he was killed by a disease and not by a human hand. So it all starts to come together. So let's talk a little bit about this type, right? This Antichrist. So in Daniel, and starting in that section where it says, his power shall be great, but not by his own power. So do you believe, or could you argue that Antiochus' power wasn't simply his? That this was perhaps a satanically empowered puppet that was at the beck and call of the prince of power of the air and the principalities? He caused fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does and destroy mighty men and the people of the saints. So he was victorious in battle. He amassed great power and wealth, and he does it by persecuting God's people. So he fulfills that role. By his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. So Antiochus was known for being shrewd and deceptive, and being a double crosser. So he would make a deal, and then make another deal, and you would find yourself on the short end of that deal, and then he would take over. And so he was cunning, he was plotting, and he was known for doing whatever he had to do to get the power that he wanted. And in his own mind, he shall become great. So arrogant, proud, and self-deifying. So think about that. What was his name? Antiochus Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. And without warning he shall destroy many and shall rise up against the prince of princes. So he stands in opposition to God because he thinks himself God. He threw truth to the ground, right? And desecrated the temple. So what is throwing truth to the ground? What does that mean to you?
Making a mockery of it.
So how do we know truth?
Bible.
So he anything that is directed to the people of God in Scripture, he says no. I throw it to the ground. Right? We saw that the circumcision, the kosher laws, keeping of the Sabbath. He says nope. I will kill you for it. I will throw you to the ground. And then the ultimate act is the desecration of God's temple. And think about this. What happened to the last guy who desecrated God's temple. There was a hand that came out and wrote on the wall. It was Belshazzar. We see in the book of Daniel, those who don't treat the things of God with the proper reverence are judged and replaced. That's what begins the whole story of the Medes and the Persians. So Antiochus dies from disease and not by man's hand. So again, fulfilling that prophecy. But that doesn't mean that this is simply about Antiochus. Because what is it that we learn about the Antichrist in the Greek scriptures?
Yeah, so
That he's coming again.
He's coming, all right, so he's coming, right? What do we know about him?
in Matthew, he says he's going to perform the desolation that causes.
And what is that? Right? We learn that the Antichrist puts himself in the place of God, in the temple of God. So we have someone that's done that, but that doesn't mean that's it. This is what the Antichrist looks like. God has shown us in history, He has given us a picture of what to be wary of. First, it's all roses and sunshine, and I'm coming and I'm taking over, and things are going to be great, and we're going to have a wonderful time, and you'll not know peace like you know peace with me, because I will rule, and I will give you the opportunity to be who you want to be. Oh, and by the way, yeah, I'm the most important thing, and I'm going to put myself in the place of God in the temple of your heart. And that's where I will rule. And there will be no more God. You don't worship Jesus. Who's that? Is Jesus here to take care of you? I'm here to take care of you. This is what the Antichrist looks like. So we have a great picture here of a man God is sent to show us this is what the Antichrist looks like. But ultimately, does he win? I think he dies, right? In Scripture, does the Antichrist win? Do we see that in Revelation, that he wins? No. He doesn't. And so, instead of being afraid, be aware. Be prepared. So the idea that for 2,300 evenings and mornings that the temple is shut down, guys, we can get into a lot of debate around this, right? But what the most popular one is that this is setting the stage for what's coming in the 70 weeks, right? This is what this idea of this tribulation, this time of tribulation. Some people say if you do the calculations right, it could be 7 years, it could be 3.5 years. Depending on what your eschatological outlook is, you pick what you want. You do the reading, but I could spend an hour just going through all the counterpoints. But just simply to say, there is a time, there is a fixed time that this is going to take place, and then God will intervene. And so, understanding that this is coming, and God has given us a picture. This is what the Antichrist looks like. Think back to last week. What's going to happen? Nations will rise. Nations will fall. Nations will war against God. But the Ancient of Days will take his seat, and the books will be opened, and there will be one who is worthy to take the scroll from his hand, and that is the Son of Man. Is there one that's worthy to open the scroll? He's the Lamb who sits on the throne. These are echoes. These are pictures of what is ultimately coming and has been shown to us in Scripture. So when we see these terrible things, and they are terrible things, and the people of God suffer, but so will the people of God coming suffer. In that same Olivet Discourse, does not Jesus say, "Woe to those who are born in that day"? Head to the mountains, but be prepared and know and understand. Like, this is God's saying, don't be a foolish virgin. Be awake, be ready, keep looking. Because he will come like a thief in the night. No one expected Antiochus to come, and yet he came. No one expects Hitler to come, and yet he comes. So these things are shown to us and given to us as an understanding that ultimately we can know and be prepared and have a picture of what it looks like. But have great joy and faith because what? Because God is sovereign. God is sovereign. So go on to say, the visions of the evening and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So let's think about this. So Daniel received this vision in 556 BC. The Medo-Persian invasion was still 3 years in the future. Alexander the Great arrives 222 years later. The breaking of the empire and the rise of the Seleucids is 224 years later. Antiochus IV is 388 years from the vision, and Antiochus dies 391 years after the vision. Oh, and let's not forget that Isaiah and Jeremiah beforehand had said, here comes the Medes and the Persians. So we had already known what to look for. So God in his sovereignty has given us a vision as to what's coming. We see in the book of Daniel that in the near context, that vision has been fulfilled. That vision has had legs, and we can say, yes, we can point to this and point to that, but we can't say that that's it. We can't say that that's it. This is a warning. This is a vision and a preparation for the time of the end. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Are you in the same place? When you read something like this, when you see that there is a time of suffering, that there is a time of upheaval, that there will be wars and there will be those who are persecuted for their faith, does it not make you feel a little bit overcome and lay sick? But Daniel arose and went about the king's business. So as you are going, make disciples. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus, for good works prepared for warhand, that we might walk in them. That we would do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before our God. We may not understand it. We may want to say and feel better by being able to tie things to certain things and be able to be predictive and have string maps on our walls that point to things so you know the date and the time. It's fool's work. Jesus told us no one knows the date and the time but the Father. Just be prepared. Understand this is what it looks like and will look like and will continue to look like. Is those who rise against God and put themselves in the place of God come. But ultimately, God is sovereign and God has his way. And that's the hope and the joy. And if nothing else, go back to the glorious scene of the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne with the Son of Man and know that kingdom has been ushered in. And as we heard, the kingdom of God has arrived in Christ. Any questions? Couldn't have done that good a job. Any questions?
I think this isn't really a question, comment. I think it's really interesting when you start reading through like the whole kingdom. It's like how we could be so foolish to put our hope in any kingdom, any political system, right? I mean, 'cause we do a lot, especially as Americans, like we love to be Americans. And so like, yet, it's like, we can't go completely the other side because Daniel worked for the king. Like, he arose and went about the king's business and yet did not have his hope in their political system. If anything, all of scripture is pointing to that all of these kingdoms and nations are evil. I mean, they're bent towards an opposition to the real kingdom.
When God selects the Hebrews to be his people, does he do it that they wouldn't be among the nations? They would be a nation separated from them. They would not be like them, but he didn't move them to an island. In fact, he put them in the middle of all the other nations. And what was their purpose? What was the purpose of the nation of Israel?
To bring the other nations to God.
To be a witness. Why is it that you don't work every day? Because I spend a day to worship Yahweh. You want to hear about him? Why is it that you go to this temple? I go there to worship Yahweh. Do you want to hear about him? When the people went to Babylon, they were faced with an assimilate or die situation. And God preserved them. And God restored them. In fact, it's Cyrus that allows the foundation of the temple to be relaid. If you read in the book of Ezra and you read in the book of Hosea, it's under Cyrus, the instrument and shepherd that God puts in place, that the people of Israel are restored to being Israel after their time of understanding that they're not in control, that God is. So often, right, we get into this idea that we have to live a moralistic certain way or we're not doing the right thing. Should we be doing things that are displeasing to God? No, we should not. Should we be separating ourselves? Should we be cloistering ourselves from the world? If we are, then how is it that we are going and making disciples? That idea, right? That continual idea is that we don't, it's not an idea we leave from one point and go to a point simply to do it. As I've said thousands of times, it's as you are going about doing the king's business, as you are going about doing the work that you do, make disciples. That's what our calling is. It's not to be separate. It's to be in. It's to be the good virus that goes and spreads the good news. It's not to be separate and cloistered and protective. I think about all these things that we faced when we became Christians. And the culture that a lot of Christians will develop to say, we're going to be separate so that we don't have to interact because we don't think we can sustain ourselves. God is sovereign and he will sustain you no matter what if you are faithful. And so read one of Paul's letters and see where he says, don't go out in the world. We just went through the book of Ephesians, right? The message of the book of the Ephesians is you are called to be active. Get your head on straight, know who you are, and go do the work of God. He says, be careful, right? Put on the armor of God. You're going to be faced with many things, but be prepared. Be prepared. And do God's work as you're going about your day. So, yeah, we get hung up on our president, our Congress, and all these things are important for our day-to-day lives. But if we place our faith in that, then it's faith misplaced. If Trump is president, if Pelosi is president, if Elizabeth Warren is president, if Bernie Sanders is president, it doesn't really matter. Because God's in control. And I know we say that, and we say it sometimes when it comes to, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's the president, God's in control, right? Instead of really believing it and living your life like that. That doesn't matter. You're going to be faithful. And as you're going about your work, you're making disciples. Paul tells us, right, in Romans, be submissive to the leaders because God put them there. God put them there. The Medes and the Persians don't come if God doesn't want them there. The Greeks don't come if God doesn't want them there. And then think about what I said. From the Greeks, we got the Greek language, which became the language of the world. The Romans aren't in charge unless God puts them there. But under Roman peace and on Roman roads, the message of the gospel spread in the language of Greece. God is sovereign. His way will have its way. That's all. Try and keep that in mind as you go about and have hope in that. So, wow, I got preaching. I'm sorry. Anything else? Any other questions? Anything that you went through and you're like, oh, I don't get that? Yeah.
This is kind of anecdotal, and it's not a big picture question, but I'm looking back at chapter 8, verse 12, and it says, on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn. I'm just wondering, like, who is the host? Like the heavenly host? Like,
No, all of the, so host is not always the heavenly host.
okay.
Host is a great multitude.
Okay.
So the great multitude will be given over to the horn. In other words, he'll have a pretty big kingdom.
Okay.
Once, twice, I'm done. Thank you, guys.